July 4, 1776, Philadelphia. The air hung thick with summer humidity, pressing against the brick facades of Chestnut Street like a warm, damp cloth. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, 56 men gathered in a chamber where the windows had been shut tight, not against the heat, but against British spies who might be lurking in the streets below. The room smelled of ink, sweat, and candle wax. Flies buzzed lazily through shafts of afternoon light that sliced through the heavy curtains. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, merchants hawking their wares, wagon wheels clattering over cobblestones, the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer striking iron in steady, methodical beats. But inside that room, history was being forged with nothing more than pen and paper. John Hancock lifted his quill, dipped it into the inkwell with deliberate slowness, and signed his name in bold, sweeping strokes across the bottom of a document that would echo through the centuries, the Declaration of Independence. 55 other men would follow, each signature an act of treason, punishable by death. Each stroke of the pen was effectively signing their own death warrants should the revolution fail. The scratch of quill against parchment was the only sound that mattered in that moment, a sound quieter than cannon fire, softer than musket volleys, yet more powerful than any weapon the world had ever known. This was not the beginning of the American Revolution. That had started more than a year earlier, with blood spilled at Lexington and Concord, with the siege of Boston, with the thunder of artillery at Bunker Hill. But this was something different. This was the moment when a collection of rebellious colonies transformed into something the world had never seen, a nation founded not on the divine right of kings or the accidents of geography, but on an idea that would challenge every empire, every monarchy, every established power structure on earth. The British Empire in 1776 was the most formidable military and economic force the world had ever known. Its navy ruled the seas with unchallenged supremacy. Its army had defeated the French, the Spanish, and countless indigenous peoples across 4 continents. British merchant ships carried goods from India to the Caribbean, from Africa to North America. The sun, it was said, never set on British territory. King George III sat on a throne backed by the wealth of nations, the loyalty of millions, and the might of the world's most professional military machine. Against this colossus stood 13 colonies with a combined population of barely 2.5 million people, about a third of them enslaved and unable to fight for the cause of liberty that the Revolution proclaimed. The Continental Army was a ragtag collection of farmers, merchants, and laborers who drilled with whatever weapons they could scrape together. They had no navy worthy of the name. Their treasury was empty. Their government existed only on paper. And yet, on that sweltering July afternoon, they declared themselves free. To understand the magnitude of this defiance, one must understand what the British Empire represented in the 18th century. Britain was not merely powerful, it was the very definition of power. The Royal Navy possessed over 270 ships of the line, massive floating fortresses bristling with cannon that could reduce coastal cities to rubble. Britain's professional army was trained, disciplined, and experienced in warfare across every conceivable terrain. British officers studied at military academies, read classical texts on strategy, and commanded with centuries of martial tradition behind them. British credit was the strongest in the world. British merchants controlled trade routes that spanned the globe. To challenge Britain was to challenge the established order of the world itself. The American colonists knew this. They were not naive revolutionaries drunk on romantic notions of freedom. Many of them were British subjects who had prospered under British rule, who had fought alongside British soldiers in the French and Indian War, who had grown up singing, "God Save the King." They understood exactly what they were risking. Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman of the Revolution, allegedly said at the signing, "We must all hang together, or assuredly, we shall all hang separately." The joke masked a terrifying truth. Treason was punishable by hanging, drawing, and quartering, a death so brutal that even in an age of public executions it stood out for its cruelty. Yet they signed anyway. The roots of this rebellion stretched back more than a decade, to the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. Britain had emerged victorious from that global conflict, but victory came with a price tag. The war had doubled Britain's national debt. To pay for it, Parliament looked to its American colonies, which had benefited enormously from British military protection. The logic seemed sound to the ministers in London. The colonies should help pay for their own defense. But the colonists saw it differently. They had fought in that war. They had bled on those battlefields. And now, Parliament was imposing taxes without asking their consent. The Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards. It was not a crushing financial burden, the tax was relatively modest, but it established a principle that the colonists found intolerable. Parliament claimed the right to tax them without their representation in that body. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry, a phrase that captured a profound philosophical dispute about the nature of political legitimacy and the rights of citizens. The British repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but followed it with the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's absolute authority over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear. Parliament was sovereign, and colonial assemblies existed at Parliament's pleasure. New taxes followed, the Townshend Acts, which imposed duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Colonial resistance escalated. Merchants organized boycotts, mobs intimidated tax collectors, tension simmered and boiled over into violence. On March 5, 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd of protesters in Boston, killing 5 men. The event became immortalized as the Boston Massacre, though historians would later note that the soldiers had been provoked by a mob throwing snowballs, ice, and rocks. But truth mattered less than perception. Colonial propaganda, particularly engravings by Paul Revere, depicted British soldiers as murderers firing on peaceful citizens. The image of redcoats slaughtering Americans became seared into the colonial consciousness. Parliament tried a different approach. It repealed most of the Townshend duties, but kept the tax on tea, again, not a financially ruinous measure, but a symbolic assertion of parliamentary authority. The colonists responded with the Boston Tea Party in December 1773, when protesters disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea, worth about $1.7 million in today's money, into the cold Atlantic waters. The tea leaves washed up on the shores for weeks afterward, a brown, bitter reminder of colonial defiance. The British response was swift and severe. Parliament passed the coercive acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for, revoked Massachusetts' charter, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than colonial courts. To the colonists, these measures looked like collective punishment, a heavy-handed attempt to crush dissent and intimidate the other colonies into submission. Instead, the opposite occurred. The coercive acts united the colonies in opposition. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They drafted petitions to the king, organized a continental-wide boycott of British goods, and agreed to meet again if their grievances were not addressed. King George III ignored their petitions. In his view, the colonists were disobedient subjects who needed to be reminded of their proper place. By April 1775, neither side was willing to back down. British General Thomas Gage, military governor of Massachusetts, received orders to arrest colonial leaders and seize military supplies. On April 19th, British soldiers marched toward Concord to capture a reported cache of weapons. At Lexington Green, they encountered a small group of colonial militia, farmers, and townsmen who had grabbed their muskets and assembled in the pre-dawn darkness. Someone fired a shot. To this day, no one knows which side pulled the trigger first. But in the volleys that followed, 8 colonists lay dead on the village green. The British continued to Concord, where they found and destroyed some supplies. But by then, the countryside was rising. Thousands of colonial militia swarmed toward the sound of gunfire. As the British column retreated toward Boston, colonial sharpshooters fired from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. The march back became a running battle that stretched for 16 miles. By the time the British reached the safety of Boston, they had suffered 273 casualties. The colonial militia had lost 95 men. More importantly, they had learned something crucial. They could stand against British regulars and make them bleed. War had begun, though few on either side understood how long or how terrible it would become. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775 and found itself managing a war effort without having officially declared independence. They appointed George Washington, a Virginia planter and French and Indian War veteran, as commander of the Continental Army. Washington arrived in Boston to find an army that was barely more than an armed mob, enthusiastic but undisciplined, brave but untrained, determined but desperately short of everything an army needed. The contradiction was stark. Colonial forces were fighting British troops, while colonial leaders still sent petitions of loyalty to King George III. They were rebels, but they weren't yet revolutionaries. They wanted their rights as British subjects restored, not to break away from Britain entirely. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania captured this ambivalence perfectly when he wrote, "Our cause is just, our union is perfect. We fight not for glory or conquest. We have taken up arms in defense of the freedom that is our birthright." But as the war ground on through 1775 and into 1776, the possibility of reconciliation faded like morning mist under a harsh sun. The king declared the colonies in open rebellion and hired German mercenaries, Hessians, to crush the uprising. Parliament closed colonial ports and authorized the seizure of American ships. British forces bombarded and burned coastal towns. Each British action pushed the colonists further toward the conclusion that compromise was impossible. In January 1776, a pamphlet appeared in Philadelphia that changed everything. Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, an English immigrant who had arrived in America only 2 years earlier, argued with devastating clarity that independence was not just desirable, but necessary. Paine wrote in simple, powerful prose that ordinary people could understand. He attacked the very idea of monarchy as absurd and tyrannical. Of more worth is one honest man to society, and in the sight of God, Paine wrote, than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. He ridiculed the notion that a tiny island should rule a continent. He made independence seem not radical, but inevitable, not treasonous, but rational. Common Sense sold 120,000 copies in its first 3 months in a nation of 2.5 million people that would be equivalent to selling 15 million copies today. It was read aloud in taverns, churches, and military camps. Washington had it read to his troops. The pamphlet transformed public opinion with astonishing speed. By spring 1776, colony after colony was instructing its delegates to vote for independence. The Continental Congress debated independence through June and into July. John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York formed the committee to draft a declaration. The task of writing fell primarily to Jefferson, a 33-year-old lawyer and planter with a reputation for elegant prose. He worked in a second-floor room he had rented on Market Street, writing at a portable desk he had designed himself, revising and polishing as Adams and Franklin offered suggestions. What Jefferson produced was revolutionary in every sense. The Declaration of Independence did not merely list grievances against King George III, though it did that in exhaustive detail. It made a philosophical argument that would resonate through the centuries. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," Jefferson wrote, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." These words were explosive. The idea that rights came from nature or God, not from kings or governments, challenged the entire basis of monarchical rule. The idea that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed turned the world upside down. For thousands of years, political philosophers had debated what made a government legitimate. Jefferson's answer was simple and radical: the people's consent. And if a government violated the people's rights, the people had not just the right, but the duty to alter or abolish it. This was not merely a declaration of independence, it was a declaration of universal principles. Jefferson and his colleagues were not saying that Americans deserved freedom because they were Americans, or because they were British subjects whose rights had been violated. They were saying that all people everywhere possessed natural rights that no government could legitimately take away. The implications were staggering. If the principles in the Declaration were true, and the revolutionaries insisted they were, then no monarchy was legitimate. No empire had the right to rule without consent. No system of hereditary privilege could be justified. The British were not blind to these implications. They understood perfectly well that the American Revolution threatened not just British control of 13 colonies, but the entire system of European monarchy and aristocracy. If the Americans succeeded, they would prove that ordinary people could govern themselves, that kings were unnecessary, that ancient hierarchies were artificial constructs rather than natural orders ordained by God. This is why the British fought so hard to keep the colonies. This is why European monarchs watched with such anxiety. The American Revolution was not just about taxes or territory. It was about whether the Enlightenment ideas of natural rights and popular sovereignty could survive contact with reality. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted for independence. 12 colonies voted yes. New York abstained, awaiting instructions from its provincial Congress. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that July 2nd would be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival, with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations. He was off by 2 days. The actual declaration, the formal document explaining the reasons for independence, was approved on July 4th, and that became the date America would celebrate. The men who signed the Declaration knew they were putting everything at risk. They were wealthy men, most of them, lawyers, merchants, plantation owners. They had comfortable lives to lose. Charles Carroll of Maryland was one of the richest men in America. When he signed, someone reportedly said, "There go a few millions." Richard Stockton of New Jersey was captured by the British, imprisoned, and treated so brutally that his health never recovered. Carter Braxton of Virginia, a wealthy merchant, saw his ship seized by the British and died in debt. Thomas Nelson, Jr. of Virginia, encouraged American artillery to fire on his own home in Yorktown because the British were using it as headquarters. But they also believed they were creating something worth the sacrifice. A republic based on consent, a nation founded on ideas rather than bloodlines, a society where liberty was not a privilege granted by a king, but a right that belonged to every person. The war that followed the Declaration tested that belief in ways the founders could not have imagined. The British were not going to let their colonies go without a fight. General William Howe landed 32,000 troops on Staten Island in the summer of 1776, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled. Washington's army, barely half that size, faced them on Long Island and was thoroughly defeated. The Continental Army retreated, then retreated again, falling back through New Jersey as the British pursued. By December 1776, the Revolution seemed on the verge of collapse. Enlistments were expiring. Men were deserting. Washington's army had dwindled to fewer than 3,000 soldiers, many of them barefoot, all of them cold, hungry, and demoralized. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington made one of the most audacious decisions in military history. He led his army across the ice-choked Delaware River in a snowstorm and attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton at dawn. The surprise was complete. The Americans killed or captured nearly 1,000 Hessians and suffered minimal casualties themselves. A week later, Washington evaded British forces and struck again at Princeton, scattering British regulars and capturing supplies. These were small battles tactically, but they were enormous psychologically. They proved the Continental Army could win. They gave the Revolution hope when hope was desperately needed. The war dragged on for 7 more years. The British won most of the major battles. They captured New York and held it for the rest of the war. They captured Philadelphia, forcing Congress to flee. They ravaged the southern colonies, burning plantations and freeing enslaved people who joined British forces in exchange for promises of freedom. American forces suffered through the winter at Valley Forge in 1777-1778, where disease and exposure killed more men than British bullets had. Washington's army shrank to barely 8,000 men, starving and freezing in makeshift huts, while British officers dined comfortably in occupied Philadelphia 20 miles away. But the Americans had advantages the British couldn't overcome. They were fighting on their own ground among people who, whatever their doubts about independence, generally preferred American rule to British occupation. British supply lines stretched across 3,000 miles of ocean. Every musket ball, every uniform, every horseshoe had to be shipped from Britain, a logistical nightmare that meant British armies could never be adequately supplied. British commanders had to worry about defending what they had captured, which dispersed their forces across a vast territory. The Americans could lose battles and fall back into the countryside, preserving their army to fight another day. Most importantly, the Americans found allies. The French, still smarting from their defeat in the French and Indian War, saw an opportunity to weaken their ancient enemy. French military and financial support proved decisive. French officers like the Marquis de Lafayette brought professional military expertise to the Continental Army. French troops fought alongside Americans at crucial battles. French ships challenged British naval supremacy, preventing the Royal Navy from easily moving troops and supplies along the coast. The French intervention transformed the character of the war. What had been a rebellion became a global conflict, with fighting in the Caribbean, India, and even the Mediterranean. Britain found itself facing not just American rebels, but French, Spanish, and Dutch forces. The British had to defend their empire worldwide, which meant they couldn't concentrate overwhelming force against the American rebels. The symbolism of this international support mattered almost as much as the military assistance. When France recognized American independence in 1778, it validated the Declaration's principles. One of Europe's most powerful monarchies was acknowledging that the American experiment was legitimate, that a republic could exist. Among the monarchies of the Old World, Spain and the Netherlands followed, not because they believed in republican principles, far from it, but because they recognized American independence as real and lasting. The war's turning point came at Yorktown, Virginia, in October 1781. General Cornwallis, commanding British forces in the South, fortified his position at Yorktown to await supplies and reinforcements by sea. Washington, demonstrating strategic brilliance, marched his army south from New York and linked up with French forces under the Comte de Rochambeau. Meanwhile, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse arrived off the Virginia coast and defeated the British fleet trying to relieve Cornwallis. Trapped between the American-French Army and the French Navy, with no hope of escape or reinforcement, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army of 8,000 men on October 19, 1781. Legend holds that as the British troops marched out to lay down their weapons, their bands played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether or not that detail is true, the sentiment was accurate. The British had lost. A ragtag army of American rebels, supported by French allies, had defeated the most powerful empire on earth. The world had indeed been turned upside down. Yet even after Yorktown, it took 2 more years to negotiate a peace treaty. The British still held New York and other coastal cities. Skirmishing continued, but both sides knew the war was effectively over. Britain no longer had the will or the resources to continue fighting. In September 1783, American and British diplomats signed the Treaty of Paris, which formally recognized American independence and established the new nation's borders from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to Florida. The Revolution had succeeded. Against all odds, 13 colonies had defeated the British Empire and established an independent nation. But winning independence was only the beginning. The harder question was what kind of nation America would become. The Declaration had proclaimed that all men were created equal, but the reality of American society in 1783 contradicted that principle in obvious and painful ways. Slavery remained legal and widespread, particularly in the southern states. The Constitution, drafted 4 years after independence was won, would count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation, a compromise that acknowledged their existence while denying their humanity. Women had no political rights. Native Americans were systematically dispossessed of their lands as the new nation expanded westward. The promise of equality remained largely unfulfilled for anyone who wasn't a white, property-owning male. Yet, the principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence created a standard against which American reality could be measured and found wanting. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Those words would be quoted by abolitionists arguing against slavery, by suffragists fighting for women's rights, by civil rights leaders demanding racial equality, by every movement seeking to expand the circle of American liberty. The Declaration established ideals that America has spent the subsequent 2.5 centuries trying imperfectly and incompletely to fulfill. The founding generation understood they were creating something unprecedented. They had no models to follow. Every previous republic in history had been small: Greek city-states, the Roman Republic before it became an empire, Italian city-states of the Renaissance. No one knew if republican government could work across a territory as large as the 13 states, with a population as diverse, with interests as varied. Many political philosophers believed it was impossible, that large republics inevitably collapsed into tyranny or anarchy. The founders wrestled with these questions as they drafted the Constitution in 1787. They created a system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. They divided sovereignty between the federal government and the states. They established a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties from government encroachment. They created a system that was democratic by 18th century standards, while building in safeguards against what they called mob rule. It was a conservative revolution in some ways, designed to preserve order and protect property, but it was built on radical principles about popular sovereignty and natural rights. The new nation faced enormous challenges. The economy was in ruins after 8 years of war. The government was deeply in debt to foreign creditors, and to soldiers who had fought for years without regular pay. Different states had different interests: northern commercial states versus southern agricultural states, coastal states versus western frontier regions. There was no guarantee the experiment would work. Many Europeans predicted the United States would quickly fragment into separate confederacies or descend into dictatorship. But the experiment did work, however imperfectly. The Constitution went into effect in 1789. George Washington became the first president, establishing precedents that would shape the office for centuries. The federal government slowly gained legitimacy and authority. The economy recovered and began to grow. People started to think of themselves as Americans, not just as Virginians or New Yorkers or Pennsylvanians. The symbol that captured this transformation was not a weapon or a flag, though both played their roles. It was the written word, the Declaration itself, the Constitution, the democratic newspapers and pamphlets that circulated ideas and arguments throughout the new nation. In European monarchies, the written word was often controlled and censored. In America, the First Amendment protected freedom of speech and press. Ideas could circulate freely, be debated publicly, influence public opinion and policy. This was revolutionary. It meant that power ultimately rested on persuasion, on the ability to convince citizens through argument rather than coerce them through force. The declaration that 56 men signed on that hot July afternoon in 1776 became the most reproduced document in American history. Copies were printed and distributed throughout the colonies. It was read aloud in churches, in town squares, in military camps. People who couldn't read had it read to them. The words became familiar, almost sacred. Over the decades and centuries that followed, the Declaration took on mythic status. The physical document itself, written on parchment that has faded to brown, is now preserved in the National Archives in Washington, sealed in an airtight case filled with inert gas to prevent further deterioration. Millions of visitors view it each year, peering at Jefferson's elegant handwriting, at the bold signatures at the bottom. But the Declaration's real power was never in the physical document. It was in the ideas the document expressed. Those ideas spread far beyond America's borders. The French Revolution of 1789 drew explicit inspiration from the American example, with French revolutionaries drafting their own Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Latin American independence movements in the 19th century looked to the United States as a model. European liberals fighting against monarchical absolutism quoted Jefferson's words. 20th century anti-colonial movements from India to Africa to Asia invoked the principles of self-determination and natural rights that the Declaration articulated. Ho Chi Minh, leading Vietnam's independence movement against French colonialism, opened his 1945 Declaration of Vietnamese Independence with words taken directly from the American Declaration. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The irony would become painful when the United States later fought against Vietnamese independence, but it demonstrated how deeply the Declaration's principles had penetrated global consciousness. The American Revolution established that republican government was possible, that monarchies were not inevitable, that people could govern themselves. These were not obvious truths in 1776. They became obvious, or at least believable, because the American experiment succeeded. The Revolution proved that Enlightenment philosophy could be translated into political reality, that abstract ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty could become the basis for actual governments. This is why the British fought so hard to prevent American independence. They understood what was at stake. They understood that if the American Revolution succeeded, it would inspire others, would challenge the legitimacy of monarchies. Everywhere, would begin a process that would eventually dismantle the old order of kings and aristocrats and hereditary privilege. They were right to worry. The American Revolution was the first domino. The French Revolution followed. Then came the Latin American revolutions, the European revolutions of 1848, the slow democratization of European monarchies, the collapse of empires in the 20th century. The world that emerged from these transformations would have been unrecognizable to King George III, a world where democracy was the norm, where monarchy was the exception, where the idea that governments required the consent of the governed was widely accepted even when not always practiced. None of this was inevitable. The revolution could have failed at any of 1,000 points. If Washington had been captured at Brooklyn or Princeton, if France had not intervened, if the British had pursued a different strategy, been more conciliatory or more ruthless, or simply luckier. If disease had swept through the Continental Army at a crucial moment, if popular support for independence had collapsed during the dark winter of 1776, if Cornwallis had escaped from Yorktown, the Revolution's success required courage, sacrifice, luck, and a convergence of circumstances that could easily have gone differently. The men who signed the Declaration knew all this. They knew they were gambling with their lives and fortunes on a vision of human freedom that might prove to be an impossible dream. John Adams captured this uncertainty in a letter to his wife. "I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet, through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory." Ravishing light and glory. That was the hope, the dream that sustained them through years of war and hardship, that America could be different, that a nation could be founded on ideas rather than conquest, on principles rather than power, on the consent of the governed rather than the dictates of kings. That ordinary people were capable of self-government, that they didn't need monarchs or aristocrats to rule over them, that freedom was not a privilege to be granted, but a right to be protected. The war cost approximately 25,000 American lives, about 1% of the total population. If a modern nation suffered proportional casualties, it would lose more than 3 million people. Cities had been burned, farms destroyed, economies disrupted. The new nation emerged from the war financially ruined, politically divided, and facing an uncertain future. But it emerged free. On July 8, 1776, 4 days after the Declaration was approved, the Liberty Bell rang to summon Philadelphia's citizens to hear the Declaration read aloud for the first time in public. The bell, cast in London decades earlier, bore an inscription from Leviticus: "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." The bell would later crack and become silent, but the proclamation it announced that day would echo through the centuries. The founding generation passed into history. Washington died in 1799, Adams and Jefferson both on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration they had helped create. But the nation they founded endured, grew, struggled with its contradictions, fought a civil war over the meaning of equality, and gradually, painfully, expanded the promise of liberty to more of its inhabitants. The Declaration's most radical assertion that all men are created equal remained more aspiration than reality for most of American history. But the aspiration mattered. It created a standard that exposed every failure to live up to it. When Abraham Lincoln spoke at Gettysburg in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, he reached back to the Declaration, saying the nation had been conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. When Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and proclaimed, "I have a dream," he was calling America to finally fulfill the promise made in 1776. The Revolution's legacy is complex and contested. The founders were not saints. Many owned enslaved people, including Jefferson, who wrote that all men were created equal. They exterminated or displaced Native Americans. They denied political rights to women. The nation they created was profoundly flawed, built on contradictions between its ideals and its practices. Yet the ideals themselves had power. They could be invoked by those the founders had excluded. They could be used to criticize and transform the very nation that proclaimed them. They spread across the world, inspiring revolutionaries and reformers who read Jefferson's words and asked why, if all men are created equal, their own societies denied that equality. The Declaration became a weapon that could be turned against injustice anywhere, including in America itself. This is the paradox at the heart of the American founding. The Revolution was both liberating and oppressive, both visionary and blind, both universal in its principles and particular in its application. It proclaimed ideals it did not fully understand and certainly did not fully practice. But those ideals, once proclaimed, could not be contained or controlled. They took on lives of their own, inspiring generations of people fighting for freedom, equality, and self-determination. On that July afternoon in 1776, when 56 men signed a document declaring their independence from the world's most powerful empire, they could not have known how far the ripples of their action would spread. They could not have imagined a world where monarchy would be the exception rather than the rule, where democracy would be considered the normal form of government, where their words would be quoted by people in lands they had never heard of, fighting for freedoms they had never imagined. What they knew was that they were taking a risk, a terrifying, exhilarating risk. They were betting that ideas mattered more than power, that principles could triumph over armies, that ordinary people could govern themselves without kings or aristocrats to rule them. They were declaring not just America's independence, but humanity's capacity for self-government. The signature that dried on parchment that summer day was more than ink. It was a statement of faith in human possibility. It was a declaration that the future did not have to repeat the past, that new forms of government could be created, that the world could change. And it did change, though not in the ways the founders always intended or wanted, not as quickly or completely as justice demanded, but it changed because they had dared to imagine something different. The world's most powerful empire sent its armies and fleets to crush that imagination. For 8 years, British forces fought to restore the old order, to prove that rebellion against rightful authority would fail, to demonstrate that kings could not be so easily defied. They had every advantage: better training, better equipment, better supply lines, the wealth of an empire at their disposal. But they lost to farmers with muskets who believed in an idea. They lost because ideas, once unleashed, are harder to kill than armies are to defeat. They lost because 13 colonies, poor and weak and divided, wanted freedom more than the empire wanted to keep them. They lost because the revolution was not just about America, but about a vision of human dignity and self-determination that resonated across oceans and centuries. That hot July day in Philadelphia, when men signed their names to treason and called it independence, when they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to a cause that seemed hopeless, that day a nation was born, not fully formed, not perfect, not even in many ways complete, but born nonetheless, with all the promise and all the flaws that would define it for generations to come. The scratch of quill on parchment. That sound, quieter than thunder, softer than cannon fire, echoed further and lasted longer than any battle. That sound proclaimed a truth that empires could not silence and that armies could not defeat, that all people are created equal, that they possess rights no government can legitimately take away, and that when governments become destructive of those rights, the people have the power to change them. On July 4, 1776, 13 colonies claimed that power. In doing so, they changed the world.